At 25, he was forced to marry a 65-year-old woman. But she had very specific plans. Jake Carter's hands were tied behind the wooden chair, rope burning into his wrists as he struggled against the bonds. 3 men with rifles surrounded him in the dusty barn, their faces hard and merciless in the dim lantern light. The 4th man, Luther Briggs, stood directly in front of him, holding a crumpled piece of paper that looked like it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. "Your father owed me $20,000, Luther said, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and tobacco. The smell made Jake's stomach turn. "He's dead now, buried 6 feet under, so the debt falls to you. That's how these things work, boy." Jake tried to twist his wrists free, but the ropes only dug deeper into his skin. "I don't have that kind of money," he said through gritted teeth, tasting blood where he'd bitten his own lip. Luther smiled, revealing teeth stained yellow from years of tobacco use. "I know you don't, boy. Your daddy died broke, spent everything he had on cards and whiskey. But I've got myself a solution to our little problem. You're going to marry my mother, Margaret Briggs. She's 65 years old and owns the biggest ranch in 3 counties. When you marry her, her assets become yours under the law, and then you'll sign over enough cattle and land to clear your daddy's debt to me." Jake felt his blood run cold. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising. "You can't force me to marry anyone. This is 1876, not the Dark Ages." Luther pulled his revolver from its holster and pressed the cold barrel against Jake's temple. The metal was so cold it burned. "You listen to me real careful now," Luther said quietly, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "You have exactly 2 choices in front of you. Choice 1, you marry my mother tomorrow at noon in the church. Choice 2, I put a bullet through your head right here and now, and I take what your daddy owed me from your corpse. Either way, boy, this debt gets paid." Jake's heart hammered in his chest. He could feel his pulse throbbing where the gun pressed against his skin. "What about what your mother wants? Does she even know about this plan of yours?" Luther laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "My mother does what I tell her to do. She's got more money than sense, and she's lonely. A young husband will keep her happy for whatever time she's got left. Now you give me your answer, or I'll make the choice for you." Jake closed his eyes, his mind racing through options that didn't exist. If he refused, he'd be dead before sunrise. If he agreed, at least he'd be alive, and alive meant he could find a way out of this nightmare. He took a deep breath and opened his eyes. "Fine," he said. "I'll do it, but you're going to regret this, Luther." Luther holstered his gun and patted Jake's cheek with his rough hand. "I don't think so, boy." "I really don't think so." The next morning arrived too fast. Jake stood in the small, whitewashed church, wearing borrowed clothes that hung loose on his frame and smelled like mothballs. His shirt collar chafed against his neck, and the vest was too short in the torso. He felt like a man being led to the gallows, which in a way he supposed he was. Luther and his 3 men sat in the back pews, their guns visible under their jackets as a reminder of what would happen if Jake tried to run. The preacher, an old man named Reverend Hayes, looked uncomfortable with the whole arrangement. He kept glancing at Luther and his men, then back at Jake, his watery blue eyes filled with pity and fear. The church doors opened with a creak that echoed through the small building. Margaret Briggs entered, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't what he expected at all. Despite her 65 years, she walked with the straight back and confident stride of someone who'd spent their whole life commanding respect. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, not a strand out of place. Her eyes were dark and sharp, missing nothing as they swept across the church and landed on Jake. She wore a simple but elegant dark blue dress that looked expensive, and there was something fierce in her expression, something that made Jake think of a hawk sizing up prey. She walked down the aisle without hesitation, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. When she reached Jake's side, she looked him up and down with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You must be the boy," she said quietly. Her voice was strong, not wavering with age. Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Up close he could see the lines around her eyes and mouth, the marks of a life lived in the harsh western sun. But there was also something else, an intelligence in those dark eyes that made him wonder what she was really thinking. The ceremony began. Reverend Hayes rushed through the words, stumbling over passages he'd probably recited hundreds of times before. His hand shook as he held the prayer book. Luther and his men watched from the back, their presence casting a shadow over everything. When it came time for Jake to say "I do," he hesitated. His mouth felt dry as desert sand. Margaret leaned close to him, close enough that only he could hear. "Say yes, boy," she whispered, "and trust me." Her breath smelled like peppermint. There was something in her voice, a hidden edge, a promise of something more that made him wonder if she knew exactly what was happening here and had plans of her own. He looked into her eyes and saw something there that gave him the smallest spark of hope. "I do," he said, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. The words felt heavy, like they carried weight beyond just the ceremony.
Margaret's expression didn't change, but he thought he saw the corner of her mouth twitch slightly.
"And do you, Margaret Briggs, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the Reverend asked. "I do," Margaret said firmly, without hesitation. Her voice carried through the church. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend said quickly, as if eager to be done with the whole business. Luther stood up from the back pew, his boots loud on the wooden floor. "That's real touching," he called out. "Now let's get back to the ranch and settle our business." Margaret turned to look at her son, and Jake saw something flash in her eyes. Something cold and calculating. "Of course, Luther," she said calmly. "Let's go take care of everything right now." The ride to Margaret's ranch took nearly 2 hours. Jake sat in the wagon beside his new wife, very aware of Luther and his men riding behind them on horseback. Margaret drove the wagon herself, handling the reins with practiced ease. She didn't speak during the journey, and Jake didn't know what to say, so they rode in silence. The land around them was beautiful in a harsh way, all rolling hills and distant mountains dotted with cattle that bore Margaret's brand. As they crested a hill, Jake got his first real look at the ranch, and his eyes widened. The property was massive, more land than he'd ever seen under one person's control. The ranch house itself was a sprawling 2-story building with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and sides. Dozens of smaller buildings surrounded it, bunkhouses, barns, a smithy, storage sheds. Workers moved between buildings, going about their daily tasks. This was a serious operation, worth far more than $20,000. Luther rode up beside the wagon as they approached the main house. "Let's get this done," he said. Margaret didn't respond, just drove the wagon up to the house and climbed down with surprising agility. Jake followed her, his legs stiff from the long ride. Inside, the house was even more impressive. Fine furniture filled the rooms, paintings hung on the walls, thick rugs covered the wooden floors. This was the home of someone with real wealth. Margaret led them to her study, a large room lined with shelves full of leather-bound ledgers and maps of the property. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room. Luther followed them in with his 3 men. He pulled a sheaf of papers from inside his coat and slammed them down on the desk. "Sign here," he said to Jake, pointing to a line at the bottom of the top page. "This transfers $20,000 worth of cattle and land to me, clearing your father's debt." Jake reached for the pen that sat in its holder on the desk, but before his fingers touched it, Margaret moved. She picked up the papers and tore them cleanly in half, then in half again. The sound of ripping paper was loud in the sudden silence. Luther's face went from pale to bright red in an instant. "What the hell do you think you're doing, old woman?" he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. Margaret walked calmly to a drawer in her desk and pulled it open. She lifted out a thick leather-bound book and set it on the desk with a heavy thud. Then she opened it and turned it so Luther could see the pages. "I've been documenting your criminal activities for 5 years, Luther," she said, her voice perfectly calm. "Every page of this book is filled with records of your crimes. Cattle rustling from the Henderson Ranch in the spring of '72, claim jumping on the Morrison property in '73, extortion of half the businesses in town, the murder of Frank Campbell when he refused to sell you his water rights. I have witness statements, dates, locations, and physical evidence for everything. Enough to put you and your men in prison for the rest of your miserable lives." Luther's hand dropped to his gun, but Margaret was faster than seemed possible for a woman her age. She pulled a revolver from her desk drawer, the same drawer the book had been in, and aimed it steadily at Luther's chest. "My hands might be old," she said, "but I've been shooting since before you were born, and my aim is still perfect. I can put a bullet through your heart from here without even thinking about it." Jake stood frozen, watching this woman he'd been forced to marry face down her own son, with a gun and a book full of evidence. He realized that Margaret Briggs was far more dangerous than anyone, including her own son, had given her credit for. This was no helpless old woman. This was someone who'd been planning and waiting for exactly this moment. Luther took a step back, his hand still hovering near his gun, but not drawing it. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He glanced at his men, who looked uncertain now, their eyes darting between Margaret and Luther. Margaret cocked the hammer on her revolver with a decisive click. The sound seemed very loud in the study. "I sent complete copies of everything in this book to the federal marshal in Denver 3 days ago," she said. "I sent them by special courier, paid extra to make sure they arrived safely. The marshal's probably reading through it all right now. By my estimation, he should be arriving here with deputies within the week. You can try to kill me, Luther. You can try to kill Jake. But it won't stop what's coming for you. All it will do is add 2 more murders to your list of crimes. Luther's face went pale again. His eyes darted to the book on the desk, then to the gun in Margaret's hand, then to his men. You set me up, he said. This whole thing was a setup from the beginning. Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You came to me with your scheme to force this boy into marriage so you could steal his inheritance to cover a debt his dead father owed you, a debt that I know for a fact you bought from the actual creditor for cents on the dollar. You thought you could use my money, and I'd just go along with it because you're my son. But you forget, Luther, I've known exactly what kind of man you are for years. I've watched you become a criminal and a killer, and I've been waiting for the right moment to stop you. This boy's father saved my life 40 years ago during a stagecoach robbery. I never forgot that debt. When you came to me with your plan, I saw my chance to finally repay what I owed and put an end to your criminal career at the same time. Jake's mind reeled with this information. Margaret had known everything from the start. She'd let Luther think he was in control while she'd been planning several moves ahead. Luther looked at his men again. They looked back at him, and Jake could see the calculation in their eyes. They were weighing their options, wondering if staying loyal to Luther was worth facing federal charges.
"Come on," Luther finally said to his men. "We're leaving."
He backed toward the door, keeping his eyes on Margaret's gun. "This isn't over, Ma." Margaret kept the gun trained on him. "Yes, Luther, it is. It's been over for a long time. You just didn't know it." Luther and his men left, their boots heavy on the wooden floors. Jake heard the front door slam, then the sound of horses riding away fast. Margaret slowly lowered her gun and set it back in the drawer. Then she sat down in her desk chair and let out a long breath. She suddenly looked tired, every one of her 65 years showing in her face. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Sit down, young man," she said. "We need to talk about why I really agreed to this arrangement." Jake sat, his legs feeling shaky. His whole world had turned upside down in the space of 10 minutes. Margaret pulled a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses from another drawer. She poured generous amounts into both glasses and pushed one across the desk to Jake. He took it with a hand that trembled slightly. "Your father and I were friends many years ago," Margaret began. "I was just 19, traveling on a stagecoach with my first husband, heading west to start a new life. We were held up by bandits. They killed the driver, killed the guard, and were going to kill all the passengers. Your father was on that stagecoach, too. He was only 21, but he was fast with a gun and braver than any man I've met before or since. He shot 3 of the bandits and drove the others off. My husband was wounded in the attack, shot in the chest. He died 2 days later in a hotel room in the next town. Your father stayed with us, with me, until my husband passed. Then he made sure I got safely to San Francisco where I had family. He didn't have to do any of that, but he did it anyway because he was a good man. I never forgot what he did for me." Jake took a sip of the whiskey. It burned going down, but steadied his nerves. "I never knew," he said quietly. "My father never talked much about his past." Margaret smiled sadly. "He wouldn't have. He wasn't the type to brag about his good deeds. I kept track of him over the years. I remarried. My second husband was the one who built this ranch. When he died 10 years ago, he left everything to me. I heard about your father's death 2 months ago. I sent my condolences, but you'd already left town by the time my letter arrived. Then Luther came to me 3 weeks ago with his scheme. He thought he was so clever, thought he'd found a way to get his hands on my money, but I saw through it immediately. I also saw it as an opportunity." Jake set down his glass. "So this whole marriage was just to protect me from your son?" Margaret's expression grew serious. "Partly, yes, but I also needed someone I could trust, and there's something else you need to know. I'm dying, Jake. Cancer. The doctor in Denver told me 6 months ago. He gives me maybe half a year, maybe less. I have no children I care about, obviously. Luther is my only child, and he's been a disappointment since he was old enough to make his own choices. I have no other family. When I die, everything I own would have gone to Luther by law. He would have seized it all and used it to fund more criminal activities, hurt more people. I couldn't let that happen." Jake felt a strange emotion rising in his chest. "But you barely know me. How do you know I won't just wait for you to die and then take everything for myself? How do you know I'm not just like your son?" Margaret's eyes softened slightly. "'Cause you're your father's son, and I knew your father well enough to know what kind of man he was. The kind of man who risks his life for strangers. The kind of man who stays with a dying man and his grieving wife when he could have just ridden away. That kind of character runs in families, I'm betting everything I have that you inherited his nature. Besides, she added with a slight smile, I'm not dead yet. We have time for me to make sure I'm right about you, and if I'm wrong, well, I'll have the satisfaction of knowing I kept it all away from Luther either way. Jake didn't know what to say. He looked at this woman, this stranger who was now his wife, who had just revealed she was dying and had tied her entire fortune to a bet on his character. It was overwhelming. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at her ranch. I'm going to teach you everything I know about running this place, she said. You'll need to know how to manage the hands, how to deal with the cattle buyers, how to handle the books. It's not easy work, and there's no room for weakness or stupidity. If you're going to inherit this ranch, you're going to earn it by learning how to run it properly. Are you willing to do that? Jake stood up too. Yes, ma'am, he said. I am. Good, Margaret said. We start tomorrow at dawn. Tonight, you can take the guest room on the second floor. We may be married on paper, but let's not pretend this is a real marriage. You'll have your space, I'll have mine. Jake nodded. That sounds fair. One more thing, Margaret said, turning to face him. Luther will be back. He's not smart, but he's stubborn and mean. He won't let this go, especially once he realizes the federal marshal is really coming for him. We need to be ready for that. What do you suggest? Jake asked. Margaret's eyes hardened. We prepare for war. Over the next 3 days, Margaret and Jake worked with the ranch hands to prepare for Luther's return. The hands were loyal to Margaret. Some of them had worked for her for over 20 years. When she explained the situation, they didn't hesitate to help. They positioned rifles at strategic points around the main house and barns. They set up watch rotations so someone was always keeping an eye on the road leading to the ranch. They stockpiled ammunition and food in case of a siege. Jake found himself working alongside men who'd been cowboys and soldiers, learning from them, earning their respect through hard work and honest effort. Margaret was right that Luther wouldn't give up easily. On the 4th day after the wedding, just as the sun was rising and painting the sky orange and pink, one of the hands on watch duty rang the bell that hung outside the bunkhouse. "Riders coming!" he shouted. A lot of them. Jake grabbed his rifle and ran to the main house. Margaret was already at a window looking out across the property with a spyglass. She lowered it and looked at Jake. 12 men, she said calmly. Luther brought reinforcements. They're heavily armed. Jake felt his heart start to pound, but tried to keep his voice steady. What do we do? We defend what's ours, Margaret said simply. She raised her voice so it carried through the house. Everyone to your positions. Don't fire unless they fire first, but be ready. The ranch hands moved quickly to their assigned spots. Jake took a position at a window on the ground floor that gave him a view of the front approach. He could see the riders now, 12 men on horseback riding hard toward the ranch. Luther was in the front, his face twisted with anger even from this distance. They surrounded the ranch house, their horses kicking up dust that glowed in the early morning light. Luther dismounted and walked forward until he was about 30 yards from the front porch. "Margaret," he shouted, his voice carrying across the yard. "Send the boy out here now, and maybe I'll let you live out your last few months in peace. Maybe I won't burn this whole place to the ground." Margaret opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. Jake wanted to tell her to stay inside where it was safer, but something told him she knew exactly what she was doing. She had a rifle in her hands, held casually but ready. "You're a fool, Luther," she called back. "The federal marshal arrived in town yesterday. I know because I got a telegram from the sheriff confirming it. Your wanted posters are being printed right now. Every lawman in 3 territories is going to be looking for you. If you ride away now and keep riding, you might make it to Mexico before they catch you. If you stay here and start a fight, you'll either die or end up hanging from a rope. Your choice." There was a long moment of silence. Jake could see Luther's men looking at each other, uncertainty on their faces. Then Luther drew his gun and fired at the house. The bullet splintered the wooden post next to Margaret's head, but she didn't flinch. She just raised her rifle and fired back. Her shot hit Luther's horse, and the animal screamed and reared, throwing Luther to the ground. Then all hell broke loose. Luther's men opened fire on the house, bullets smashing through windows and thudding into the wooden walls. Jake and the ranch hands returned fire. The noise was deafening, a constant roar of gunfire that made Jake's ears ring. He aimed and fired, working on instinct more than thought. He saw one of Luther's men fall from his horse, clutching his shoulder. Another man's horse was hit and went down, throwing its rider. The battle was chaos. Smoke from the gunpowder filled the air, making it hard to see. Jake moved from window to window, firing at the attackers. He'd never been in a real gunfight before. The closest he'd come was shooting at tin cans for practice. But adrenaline took over, and he found himself moving and shooting without thinking, his body acting on pure survival instinct. Margaret fought beside him, calm and precise in her movements. She fired, reloaded, and fired again with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Every shot she took was carefully aimed. Jake saw her hit one man's gun right out of his hand, saw her put a bullet through another man's hat, making him duck and run for cover. She was a woman who had survived in a harsh land for decades, and it showed in every calculated shot she took. The fight went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 45 minutes. Luther's men had taken cover behind a water trough and some wagons, using them as shields while they fired at the house. The ranch hands had better positions and better cover, but Luther's men had more ammunition and seemed willing to waste it. Then Jake heard something that changed everything. It was the sound of horses approaching fast, a lot of them, and the clear note of a bugle call. He risked a glance out the window and saw a group of riders coming up the road. They were led by a man wearing a federal marshal's badge that caught the sunlight. Behind him were at least a dozen deputies, all armed. The lawmen had arrived. Luther saw them too. Jake watched as panic crossed his face. Luther shouted something to his men, and they started to scatter, abandoning their positions and running for their horses. But the deputies were already spreading out, surrounding them. Some of Luther's men threw down their weapons and raised their hands immediately. Others tried to run but were quickly caught. Luther himself made it to a horse and tried to ride away, spurring the animal hard. But one of the deputies, a young man with a rifle, fired a single shot. The bullet hit Luther in the leg, and he fell from the horse with a scream of pain. Within minutes it was over. The deputies had all of Luther's men in custody, hands bound behind their backs. Luther lay on the ground, clutching his bleeding leg and cursing. The federal marshal, a stern-looking man with a thick mustache and iron-gray hair, dismounted and walked up to the porch where Margaret still stood. "Mrs. Briggs," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I got your package. Very thorough documentation. I'll need you to testify when we bring these men to trial." Margaret lowered her rifle and smiled. "I'd be happy to, Marshal." The marshal looked at the house, seeing the bullet holes and broken windows. "Looks like we got here just in time." "Almost," Margaret said. "But we were holding our own." The marshal smiled slightly at that. "I don't doubt it, ma'am." He turned and shouted orders to his deputies, directing them to secure the prisoners and tend to the wounded. Jake set down his rifle and walked out onto the porch. His hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was starting to fade. Margaret looked at him and must have seen something in his face because she put a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, boy," she said quietly. "You stood your ground when it mattered. That's what counts." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He watched as the deputies loaded Luther and his men onto horses, preparing to transport them to jail. Luther looked back at the house, at Margaret, and Jake saw nothing but hatred in his eyes. But he also saw defeat. Luther knew it was over. As the lawmen rode away with their prisoners, the ranch hands started coming out of their positions. A few were injured, minor wounds from flying splinters, and one grazed arm, but no one was seriously hurt. The workers started checking the property for damage, already talking about repairs. Margaret went inside and sat down heavily in a chair in the front room. Jake followed her and saw that her hands were shaking slightly, the first real sign of weakness he'd seen from her. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "Just tired. Fighting takes more out of you when you're my age." She looked up at him. "We did it, Jake." "Your father would be proud." Jake pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "Thank you," he said, "for everything. For saving my life. For trusting me." Margaret waved a hand dismissively. "Don't thank me yet, boy. Now comes the hard part. We've got a ranch to run, and running it is going to test you in ways a gunfight never could. You're going to have to learn everything, and I'm not an easy teacher. I don't accept excuses or laziness. If you're going to do this, you're going to do it right." "I'm ready," Jake said, and he meant it. "Good," Margaret said. "We start first thing in the morning. Tonight, let's just rest and be grateful we're still alive." The next several months passed in a blur of hard work and intensive learning. Margaret proved to be every bit as tough a teacher as she'd warned. She woke Jake before dawn every day and kept him working until after dark. She taught him how to read the ranch's financial books, how to spot when cattle buyers were trying to cheat him, how to manage the hands without being either too soft or too harsh. She taught him about water rights and grazing patterns, about treating animal diseases and predicting weather. She showed him the maps of the property and explained the history of every piece of land, who they'd bought it from, and why it mattered. Jake absorbed it all like a sponge soaking up water. He discovered he had a natural talent for the work, an instinct for reading situations and making decisions. Under Margaret's guidance, he began to truly understand what it meant to run a successful ranch. It wasn't just about being tough or good with a gun. It was about being smart, being fair, being willing to work harder than anyone else. The ranch hands started to respect him. At first they'd been skeptical, seeing him as just some kid who'd married the boss out of obligation. But as they watched him work alongside them, getting his hands dirty, never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself, their attitudes changed. They started coming to him with problems and questions, started treating him like a real boss instead of just Margaret's husband on paper. Luther and his men went to trial in federal court. The evidence Margaret had compiled was overwhelming. Luther was convicted of murder, cattle rustling, extortion, and a dozen other charges. He was sentenced to hang. His men received long prison sentences. Jake and Margaret both testified at the trial, and Jake had to face Luther one last time in the courtroom. Luther stared at him with pure hatred, but said nothing. The judge's gavel came down, and it was finally over. Margaret's health declined steadily, just as the doctor had predicted. By late autumn, she was spending more time in bed than up and moving, but her mind stayed sharp until the very end. Even when she was too weak to leave her room, she'd have Jake bring her the books and reports, and she'd go through them line by line, correcting his mistakes and teaching him better ways to handle things. On a cool evening in early November, Margaret called Jake to her bedroom. She'd been confined to bed for the past week, too weak to stand. Her skin had taken on a gray pallor, and she'd lost weight until she looked fragile as paper. But her eyes were still bright and alert when Jake entered the room. "Sit down," she said, her voice weak but clear. Jake pulled a chair close to the bed and sat. "How are you feeling?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "I'm dying," she said bluntly. "Probably won't see another sunrise. The doctor was here this morning, though he didn't need to tell me what I already know." Margaret Jake started, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Let me talk while I still can," she said. "I want you to know that these past months have been a gift. I thought I would die alone and bitter, surrounded by money, but without anyone who actually cared about me. But you've given me something I didn't expect, something I'd given up hoping for. You gave me family." Jake felt tears burning in his eyes. "You saved my life, Margaret. More than you know." She smiled, the expression making her look younger for a moment. "We saved each other, Jake. That's what family does. We take care of each other. You've proven everything I believed about you. You're your father's son, good and honest and willing to work hard. This ranch is going to be in good hands. I'm just sorry I won't be around to see everything you do with it." Jake reached out and took her hand. It felt small and frail in his, the bones, like bird bones. "I'll make you proud," he said. "I promise. I know you will," Margaret said. Her eyes started to close. "I'm tired now. I think I'm going to rest. You go on now. Get some sleep. You've got work in the morning." Jake stood up but didn't leave. He stayed by her bedside, holding her hand. Margaret's breathing gradually slowed, became shallower. Just before midnight, she took one last breath and let it out slowly. Then she was gone. Jake sat there for a long time, holding the hand of the woman who'd been his wife for less than half a year, but who'd taught him more than most people learn in a lifetime. Finally, he stood up and gently laid her hand on her chest. He walked to the window and looked out at the ranch, at the land that was now his responsibility. The moon was bright enough that he could see the outlines of the barns and the distant shapes of cattle in the fields. Somewhere an owl called, a lonely sound in the night. Jake wiped his eyes and made himself a promise. He would run this ranch the way Margaret would have wanted. He would honor her memory and her teachings. He would be the man she'd believed he could be. Jake stood at Margaret's grave a week after the funeral. The whole town had turned out for the service, which surprised him until he realized how many people Margaret had helped over the years. The preacher had talked about her generosity, her strength, her fairness. Person after person had come up to Jake to tell him stories about things Margaret had done for them. Money lent when times were hard, jobs given when work was scarce, advice offered freely. Jake had known she was respected, but he hadn't understood the depth of it until he saw the genuine grief on the faces of the people who'd known her. Now it was late afternoon, and everyone had gone home. Jake stood alone by the grave, a black hat in his hands. The headstone was simple granite, with her name, dates, and the words, "beloved wife and friend." Margaret had left instructions for it before she died. She hadn't wanted anything fancy. The ranch foreman, an older man named Carl, who'd worked for Margaret for 20 years, approached and stood beside Jake. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking at the grave. Finally he spoke. "She was one of a kind," Carl said. "There won't be another like her." Jake nodded. "She taught me that strength isn't just about being tough or good with a gun. It's about being smart, being prepared, and being loyal to the people who matter. It's about doing the right thing even when it's hard. Carl smiled. She'd be glad to hear you learn that. What are you going to do now, boss?
The question hung in the air. Jake looked out across the vast property.
From here on the hill where the small family cemetery sat, he could see for miles, rolling hills dotted with cattle that now belonged to him. The ranch buildings in the distance, the mountains rising blue and purple on the horizon, this land, this empire that Margaret had built and maintained, was now his responsibility. I'm going to run this ranch the way she would have wanted, Jake said. Fair and honest, treating the workers right, never backing down from anyone who tries to take what's ours. I'm going to make this place even better than it is now, expand it, improve it, make it something that lasts. And someday when I have the chance, I'm going to help someone the way she helped me, because that's what she would have done. Carl clapped him on the shoulder. Sounds like you learned well, boss. She chose right when she chose you. They walked back toward the ranch house together. Jake felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but it didn't feel crushing. It felt right. He thought about the strange path that had brought him here. A forced marriage that should have been a prison sentence had instead become his salvation. A debt his father owed had turned into a debt repaid across generations. An old woman facing death had given a young man a chance at life. As they reached the porch of the ranch house, Jake placed his hat back on his head. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple. He'd always remember this view, this moment. The ranch hands were finishing up their work for the day. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney. Horses moved in the corrals. The whole property hummed with life and purpose. Carl headed toward the bunkhouse, but Jake stayed on the porch for a few minutes longer. He thought about Luther, rotting in a jail cell waiting to hang for his crimes. He thought about his father, who'd saved a young woman on a stagecoach 40 years ago and never knew that single act of kindness would echo forward through time to save his own son. He thought about Margaret, fierce and clever and kind in her own way, who'd taken a stranger and turned him into family. Jake went inside. The house felt empty without Margaret, but it didn't feel sad. It felt like she was still there in a way, in the furniture she'd chosen, in the books she'd read, in the very walls that had sheltered her for so many years. He walked to the study and sat at her desk, now his desk. The leather-bound book of evidence against Luther still sat on a shelf, a reminder of everything that had happened. Jake pulled out the ranch ledgers and opened them. There was work to do, always work to do on a ranch this size. He had payroll to figure out, supply orders to place, a dozen other tasks, but he didn't mind. This was his life now, and he'd earned it. The story of how a 25-year-old man was forced to marry a 65-year-old woman should have been a tragedy. It should have ended with Jake trapped in a loveless marriage or dead at Luther's hands. But instead, it had become something else entirely. It had become a story about courage and redemption, about the unexpected bonds that form when people choose to do the right thing, about debts of kindness that span generations, about an old woman facing death who chose to create life and hope instead of giving in to bitterness. Margaret Briggs had been many things in her 65 years. She'd been a survivor, a businesswoman, a rancher. She'd been tough as nails and sharp as a razor. But in her final months, she'd been something more. She'd been family to someone who needed it desperately. She'd been a teacher and a protector. She'd been the answer to a prayer Jake hadn't even known he was praying. Jake worked late into the night, going over the books by lamplight. He had a ranch to run, workers who depended on him, and a legacy to honor. Margaret had given him the tools and the knowledge to succeed. She'd believed in him when he barely believed in himself. Now it was up to him to prove worthy of the trust she'd placed in him. Outside, the moon rose over the ranch. Cattle lowed softly in the distance. The wind whispered through the grass. The land that had been Margaret's was now Jake's, and he would guard it and grow it with everything he had. He would face whatever challenges came with the same strength and intelligence Margaret had shown him. He would build on the foundation she'd laid, and someday, maybe, he'd find someone to pass it all on to, someone who would appreciate the story of how it came to be. But that was far in the future. For now, Jake Carter was 25 years old, the owner of the biggest ranch in 3 counties, and the inheritor of a legacy built on courage, cleverness, and kindness. He closed the ledgers and stood up, stretching muscles sore from a long day of work. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make, new problems to solve. But he was ready for it. Margaret had made sure of that. Jake walked upstairs to his room, the floorboards creaking under his feet. He looked out the window one last time at the land spread out under the stars. This was home now. This was his purpose. This was the life Margaret had given him, and he would live it to the fullest. He would make every decision count. He would treat people fairly. He would never forget where he came from or who had saved him. And he would carry Margaret's lessons with him always, a gift more valuable than all the land and cattle in the world. The forced marriage that began with a gun to his head had ended with Jake finding his true calling. Sometimes he thought as he finally lay down to sleep, the worst moments in life lead to the best outcomes. Sometimes being forced down one path opens up possibilities you never imagined. Sometimes the people who seem like strangers turn out to be exactly who you needed, all along. Jake closed his eyes and slept deeply, dreamlessly. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow he would start building the future Margaret had made possible. But tonight, he could rest, knowing he'd kept his promise. He'd made her proud.